All right, so we are here with a tutorial video on how to use Pyret, and we will be using Pyret to analyze a data set and see if we can pull some interesting information out of this data set. The key thing we're trying to do here is trying to find some insight in our data, or possibly some correlations that maybe we didn't know existed before. Ideally, we're just going to try to find something interesting here. And basically, Pyret is going to help us do that. So let's get started. And the very first thing we need to do is we need to start by opening up a fresh Pyret file. And I will include a link to this file in the comment section of the video, so be sure to check that out. But basically, once you have this open, you do want to save a copy of it. That is very important. So we're going to save a copy, and ideally you want to put your last name in front. Something similar to that, and click save. That way you have a copy of your file. Once we have that, you'll notice that this project is broken up into 3 parts. So we're going to start up here first, then we're going to move on to part 1, part 2, part 3, etc. So very first thing we need to do is we actually need to import a couple different libraries into our Pyret program or our Pyret file so that we can do certain things with Pyret. And basically, programming languages do not always come with all of the libraries preloaded. If they did, it would take up a ton of space on your computer and it might run slowly. So we're going to include a couple things here. The very first thing, this will be included in your file when you open it. This is just a specific data science library that was made just for us, for Bootstrap World. So this is already going to be there for you. But the other things we're going to include are the following. So I'm going to type the word include, and you'll notice it gets bold. That means that is a keyword in Pyret. So this word does something, right? I can't use this word as a variable later on. That's why it's bold. So I want to include, I'm going to include tables. And what tables are going to do is tables are going to let us work with tables, exactly as it sounds, inside of Pyret. Okay, and we're also going to include a library called image. And what image does is it allows us to create different images in Pyret. It also allows us to create different types of graphs that we might want to use later on. That's all included in the image library. We also want to include something called G-Drive-Sheets. This is a library that allows us to use Google Sheets. And if you're familiar with Google Sheets or not familiar with Google Sheets, it's basically just a spreadsheet that's offered through Google. And a spreadsheet is just a great way to keep all your data in one place and organize it and do different things with it. So we'll look at a Google Sheet in just a few minutes here. And that should be all of the libraries that we need. So now we have included a couple different libraries that will allow us to do more with Pyret. So I'm going to hit run, the top right, and I'm going to do that to basically load these libraries into our file. And I also want to make sure there's no errors that are going to pop up. So as you can see, all this code so far has compiled, and compiled means our program Pyret runs the code and it checks for any errors, and then it actually processes the code. So you can see here there were no errors. So far so good. Okay, now that we've got our libraries imported into our Pyret project, what we need to do now is pick a data set to actually look at, to import into our Pyret file, and we'll take that information and analyze it and see if we can pull out some interesting information or maybe find a correlation somewhere. So the data set that we're going to use for this project is, it says copy of soda, coffee, and other drinks. So it's basically a data set that contains just information about different beverages, it looks like. So you can see here we've got the name of the drink, we've got a type of drink, we've got, is it sugar-free, calories, some different figures here in the data set. And you'll notice that this is in a Google Sheet spreadsheet. So this is just a program, if you're not familiar with it, that allows us to sort information, right, in a sort of a logical way. So this is the data set we're going to use, and you will have access to this. So if you go down to the comment section of the video, you should see a link for this data set. So real quick, this spreadsheet is going to be view only, which means you're not going to be able to make any changes to it, right? I'm able to make changes to it because it's my copy, but you will not be able to. So what you first need to do in order to get this information into Pyret is come up to File and click Make a Copy. Okay, and you can leave it just like this, that's totally fine. Or you can rename it if you want to, but I'm gonna leave it as is, hit OK. And you'll notice it creates a new copy. What I'm also gonna do is just close the old copy so I don't get confused between the two. And now I've got this, my own copy of this data set. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all of the extra columns that are in the spreadsheet. So the way I do that is I click on the first column that is empty, and I'm going to hold Shift and Control, or Shift and Command if you're on a Mac. I'm going to hold those two keys down, and I'm going to press the right arrow key. What that's going to do is just going to highlight all of the empty columns. Another way to do it is you can just click on the column. You click on the column and then drag to the end, and then two-finger tap or right-click on this top bar up here where the letters are and click Delete Columns. And we're going to do the same thing for the rows. It's not as necessary as the columns, but it just kind of cleans everything up. So same thing, click here. Now this one might be a little more difficult because there's a lot of rows, so you can drag it to the bottom if you want to, or you can do that trick that I just showed you where you hold down Shift Control or Shift Command and do the down arrow key. It'll highlight everything else. And then again, two-finger tap or right-click on the row number and click Delete. So right here, we should have a data set that is all nicely organized with no extra columns and no extra rows. If you need a second to do that, go ahead and pause the video and do that now, and then come back. Okay, so let's keep going. So now that we've done that, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come up to the right over here and click Share. And what we're going to do is we are going to change. So your screen might look a little different from mine, but essentially you want to click on this Get Link information. And what you want to do is you want to share this copy, the spreadsheet, with anyone who has the link. Leave it to viewer, don't change it to editor. That means somebody else could change your spreadsheet. So just leave it as viewer and click done. Once we've done that, we need to copy a very unique ID from our spreadsheet. So I will show you how to do that. Okay, so here's how we find the ID for our spreadsheet. And this is what's going to allow us to import all of this information here. So if you come up to the URL bar at the top of the screen in Chrome or whatever browser you're in, you will see a code, and the code is going to go between this lowercase d right here and the word edit. There is a code in here, and this code is just used to identify your document. And so you'll see that I've highlighted this code, and I'm not including the /, And I'm not including the lowercase d or the word edit. I'm just including the code inside of those forward slashes. Okay, so you can two-finger tap and click copy, or you can do Control or Command C to copy. And then we're gonna head back over to our spreadsheet. To our Pyret document. So you'll see right here, it says, this first part says load your spreadsheet and define your table below. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna create something called a variable. And I'm gonna call this variable sheet ID, sheet-ID, and I'm gonna put an equal sign. So what a variable is it's just a temporary, thing that's gonna house something else. Okay, and what I mean by that is we're gonna use the word sheet ID, sheet-ID, to represent the code that is from our spreadsheet, rather than having to type this out or deal with this later on. So we're gonna make this a variable. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna type a quotation mark, and I'm going to do Control V and paste my code, and then I'm gonna close my quotation marks. And you're gonna see this turns green, okay? And in Pyret, we have 3 main data types. So we have 3 main data types, and those 3 data types are strings, numbers, and Booleans. Okay, and we'll get into numbers and string and Booleans later on, but we'll just talk about strings for right now. So strings are going to be green, and they are going to be anything that are inside quotation marks. And strings normally represent words or statements or sentences or things like that. But strings can also contain numbers. They can contain symbols. It's just really anything that are inside of, or anything that's inside of quotation marks. So we've got our sheet ID here, which is perfect. So what I need to do now is I want to take my sheet ID and I want to load my spreadsheet into Pyret. So I haven't loaded anything yet. I just created a variable that has this string attached to it. I'm going to create another variable, and I'm going to call it drinks spreadsheet. Drinks spreadsheet. And that's going to be my variable because obviously my data set deals with drinks. So say drinks spreadsheet, and it's a spreadsheet, of course. Also, you'll notice that I'm using one equal sign. When we're programming, one equal sign does not really mean that it equals something. What it means is that I'm assigning this information here to this variable. Okay, so an equal sign doesn't quite mean equals like it would in math. Okay, there is another symbol that we'll use that represents equals, but we'll come to that later. So we got drink spreadsheet, and I'm going to type in a function, and the function is called load-spreadsheet. So load-spreadsheet, this is a function, and what this function does is it's built into Pyret. Well, and actually it's built into this library. I believe it's this library. And what this function does is it takes a spreadsheet and it brings it into Pyret. And you'll see here that I put parentheses at the end of the function. What goes inside parentheses are these things we call parameters. And same thing you would see in algebra is parameters are the input for a function. So parameters are the input for a function. And so this function called load spreadsheet, it takes a sheet ID. It takes this information, and with this information, it will load the spreadsheet into Pyret. Okay. Now, instead of copying this whole long code and dropping it in here, that's why I created a variable called sheet ID. Sheet-ID. Now remember, if I spell this wrong, if I put a capital here rather than a lowercase, this will not work. Okay, computers are not smart. Computers do not understand that you're trying to say that this right here is the same as this. Computer does not understand that. It has to be identical. Otherwise, it will not work. So we're going to do drinks-spreadsheet. We're going to load our spreadsheet, and we're going to pull in that sheet ID. So now I'm just going to click run over on the top right. And I just want to compile all my code, make sure there's no errors. As you can see, nothing popped up on this side, so we should be good. Now, before I actually go any further, I forgot to mention this. In Pyret, we have two windows. On the left side, we call this area sort of the definition side. This is where we write a lot of our code. And on the right side is where that code is going to be, or what the output of this code is going to be displayed. It'll be displayed on the right side. Okay, we can also interact with our code on the right side. So we call this the interactions area, but we'll see how that works in a second. So far, I've got my sheet ID, I've got my spreadsheet loaded. That is all perfect. What I want to do now is create a data table. I'm going to create a data table that I can now use in Pyret. So here's how we're going to do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start off by creating a variable again. So we're going to call this drinks-table. Now remember, this is different from my sheet ID, and it's different from my drinks spreadsheet. My drinks spreadsheet is this right here. What I'm creating now is a data table that is going to work inside of Pyret using all of the data from this spreadsheet. So we say drinks-table. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in a keyword called load-table. And I'm going to put a colon after it and a space. Now what's going to happen here is we are going to type out the titles of the columns of our table. So we want to make a table that has columns, and then each of the rows in that table are going to be a different piece of information. So if I go back to my spreadsheet, you'll see that horizontally, these are the rows, right? We've got the name of a drink, and then we've got all the information of that drink or about that drink. But the very top row is actually like the titles of each column, right? Or we can call them categories, right? So we got a type category, sugar-free, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a quick way to do this, but we do have to be really careful with the way we do it. So watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to start at the top left, and I'm going to highlight this top row, which is my column titles. So I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to copy it. So Control-C or Command-C, depending on what computer you're on. And I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to do Control-V. Now this, I have to make some changes here. This is not going to work as is, and I'll explain why it's not going to work. So first off, in Pyret, we need to tell Pyret where the names of these columns, where they end and where they begin. And the way we do that is by using a comma. So the first column of my table, I'm going to call name. Now you'll notice that I did not make this a string. And I'm not making it a string because it's not a string. It is, you'll see that the color of the font is like a regular black. It's not bold. And it's kind of the same as my variables over here. So a column is going to be a little similar in a way to a variable, but it's not a string, it's not a variable, it's representing the name of a column in your data table. So I'm going to go through and I am going to put commas in to separate my columns. Now, one thing you'll notice, okay, sugar-free is a column, but you'll notice that there's a space here, right there. I cannot have spaces in the columns. I can't have spaces like this. And in programming in general, if you have spaces like this, or spaces, for example, in a variable name, like if I came over here on line 13 and I did like sheet space ID, That's not going to work. It's going to give me an error because what happens is when Pyret or any other programming language goes to read this, it sees a space and it doesn't know where to stop, right? So it'll throw an error because it doesn't know what else to process after that space. So we got to be really careful there. So what I like to do is, instead of a space, I like to put in an underscore. And then another thing that's really funny, just in general in programming, is symbols. So using symbols in variable names or column names, we sort of want to avoid that. Okay, so I'm going to take out that question mark. And this column is actually a column that only has two possible answers, true or false. So I'm actually going to just rename it, and I'm going to say is sugar-free. Is it sugar-free, yes or no? So I'm going to call it is sugar-free. Then we got a column called calories. We got one called fat, and you'll notice I've got a space here, which I have to get rid of, and I've also got parentheses. I need to get rid of those. And so I'm just going to do something similar like that. And I'm just going to go through and do this for everything really quickly. And one thing I should mention, you'll see here, we've got the number 200. And if I go over to my table, or my spreadsheet, you'll see that it says the 200 calorie weight in grams. Another thing about programming is that you can't have variables or things like that that start with a number. Okay, and you can tell that this is a number because the color of it is like this sort of dark blue. So this is not going to work. This is going to throw an error. So what I'm going to do is actually get rid of the 200 from the front. I'm going to get rid of the spaces, get rid of the parentheses. However, you can put a number inside of a variable name, as long as it does not start with a number. So you'll notice that this is now turned black, but if I had put it in the front, it would be this sort of blue color. Okay, so far we have our drinks table. This is the name of our table. We've used the keyword load table. We have named out all of our columns. And just to be on the safe side, I'm gonna go back here and just count my columns, make sure I have the correct number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 columns, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And I'm going to double check over here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 columns. Okay, so we should be good. Now what I'm going to do is hit enter, and I'm going to type in the keyword source. You'll see that turns bold as well. And the source is going to be, so the source of all of this information that's going to fit in the columns that I've labeled here is going to be the information from this spreadsheet. So I'm going to type in drinks-spreadsheet. And again, if this is spelled in any way differently from what this is spelled here, it will not work. And then I'm going to use another function. And this function is a little different than, for example, this function up here, like load spreadsheet. This one, we need a dot. And oftentimes we call these things methods in programming. And so but it's still a function. So drinks.spreadsheet, and the function name is called sheets by name. open and close parentheses. And inside here, we need two parameters for this function, the dot sheet by name function. We need two parameters. Okay, and if you remember from up here, parameters are input that we need to make this function work. So the two parameters are this. The first one is the name of the tab that my data is actually in within the spreadsheet. So if you look down here, this says beverages and it's lowercase. So this parameter takes the name of the tab as a string. So I'm going to type in beverages. You'll see it turns green. And then it takes in this thing called a Boolean, which we haven't talked about yet. But a Boolean is simply a true or false value. Okay, a Boolean only has two options. It's either true or false, sometimes represented by 1 for true, 1 for true, and 0 for false. And this is actually one of the key ways that computers actually work, is by being able to use different Booleans in different ways. So we're going to give it the true Boolean. What true is going to tell Pyret is that the top row, when it imports our spreadsheet, this top row is not data, it's actually the names of the columns. So true tells Pyret that this is not data here. Okay, let's go ahead. And then the last thing we need to do, type the word end at the bottom. And you'll see that when I type end, this whole thing highlights here. That tells me that Pyret recognizes that we have just created a table that we're going to use. So let's go ahead and run this. And it looks like we've got an error. And here's why we have an error. So you'll notice right here, I typed sheet underscore ID. And actually, I want to have it as a dash. But then here I typed it as sheet dash ID. So again, these two things don't match. Pyret does not know I mean this means this. It doesn't know unless it's exactly the same. So we're going to run that. And everything is compiled. There are no errors. So let's test this on our interaction side and see if our data table actually works. So the name of my data table is called drinks table. So let's type this in, see if it works. Okay, and now you can see we have this nice big data table. It's got the names of our drinks. It's got all the columns. It looks pretty good. Now, before we move on, I just wanted to go over really quickly what a function is. So we've talked about this a couple times so far. What is a function? So what is a function? So just like in math, a function is something that takes an input, does some work with that input, and then outputs a result of some sort. So if you think back to math class, one of the most common functions you might look at, you might have seen something that looks similar to this. So f of x equals, we'll say x times, and just FYI, in programming, and we'll see this later on, but the asterisk symbol, which is shift and the number 8 on your keyboard, this represents multiplication when we're dealing with computers. So f of x equals x times, we'll say something like 0.25. So this is just a basic function, right? And what it's saying is the function of x, this is the input here. This is the parameter. So if we were to then say something like this, well, what is f of 3? Well, all that is we just replace the x with 3, and we would multiply it by 0.25. And functions work exactly the same way in programming, except we have just a lot more control over what we can do. We don't have to necessarily do things with math. We can do things like this, where this function pulls in an ID and it loads a spreadsheet into a computer. So we're going to use a lot of functions going forward, both in Pyret and in other languages. So if you ever get into programming, you're going to be making a lot of functions that do lots of really cool things. Okay, so far, so good. That's going to bring us to the end of our first video. So you should, at the end of this video, have all of your data loaded into Pyret and ready to work with. All right, we'll see you with part 2, where we jump into some of the data analysis.